that. And so I said, no, not doing that. I mean, I could have done the same thing as some other students have, but I didn't want to do that. And another thing they did is because they charged me a little bit more, it actually helped funded some scholarships for some students that are in South Africa that couldn't afford it. So I felt like that was a pretty good deal to do. And I just finished my oral defense like 2 weeks ago. I think like Thursday will be 3 weeks ago. Got like 2.5 weeks ago now. 3 weeks this coming Thursday. And my dissertation title is Perfect Being Theology and Molinism as a View of Divine Providence, an Anselmian Critique of Middle Knowledge. Every dissertation has to have this long, pretentious title, to it, and it's really just your thesis is what it is, the title. And so I looked at the view of Molinism as a view of providence. There's different models of providence, and I looked at just a particular view of providence, of Molinism, through the lens of what we call perfect being theology. Perfect being theology is the approach of examining the attributes of God and seeing him as a maximally great being, or having the maximally great attributes to the highest degree. And I said, that's interesting to just look at the attributes. Can't we look at other doctrines like providence and actually, because different views of providence do different things to God's attributes, and then we ought to look for the view of providence that maximizes God's attributes to the highest degree. And I argued for Molinism. And obviously I was successful because they gave me a PhD for it, right? Is what they did. So I don't know if that was successful or not. Yeah, Molinism. I'm actually going to use it tonight. Is what I'm going to do. So Molinism was developed by a Jesuit Spanish Catholic theologian during the 16th century named Luis de Molina, hence the word Molinism after him, in which he was viewing what was happening in the Reformation with Luther and Calvin, and he was concerned that their views of divine providence eliminated human freedom, is what he did. And he says, well, we don't want to eliminate human freedom, so he began to develop a view called middle knowledge that, according to Aquinas, there's two moments of God's knowledge. You have natural knowledge, you have free knowledge. And natural knowledge is God's knowledge of all possibilities, all the logical possibilities of what you could do in any situation, all right? What is logically possible. Free knowledge is when God creates with his creative divine decree, it's what we will do in that situation, what we will freely do in that situation. He brings about that situation that we freely engage with. All right? And of course, the problem is like, wait, if he creates that, then that's what we're going to do. And we really don't have freedom anymore, do we? All right? And so there's a loss of a genuine freedom. And there's a whole host of issues like, well, what do you do with ethics and responsibility, afterlife, that kind of stuff, And Molina said, okay, here's another view. So we got free knowledge, we got natural knowledge, then there's middle knowledge, hence the term, because it comes in between free and natural knowledge. So natural knowledge is what we could do, freely do in any situation. Middle knowledge is what we would do, freely do in any situation, right? Whether we're in that situation or not, right? So we know, well, like for example, I could, have worn a red shirt in the situation tonight, or I could have wore this, I guess, brownish shirt, in this situation. Both of those are logical possibilities, right? That's God's free knowledge. Now, given that I'm in this situation here tonight, not only does God know what I could do, he knows what I would freely do, wear the brown shirt. Now, could I have done differently? Yes, but I wouldn't freely. I'm going to wear the brown shirt. That's what I would freely do. And God knows what you're going to freely do in any situation. In fact, he knows what I could have done, what I would have done if I did not agree to come tonight and speak to you on the faith and evangelize. And that situation never came about, but he knows what I would freely do even in that situation, even situations you're not in. Given those feasible worlds of what we would freely do, which there's a limitation to those, then he picks one of them, and predestines that world, and that's what we will freely do. It basically, God is sovereign, he predestines all things, but he does not cause all things itself. And he utilizes libertarian, what they call in philosophy, libertarian free will, to bring about the worlds that we are in itself. And so I analyzed that from a perfect being theology perspective. I mean, it's a real interesting, way to look at it. All right, tonight I'm going to talk about the fate of the unevangelized. I don't know why I have this. I just look cool, right? Because we sort of talk about other religions and things. In fact, I actually want to start with that, with other religions. I'm going to show you a quick video that shows the origins and growth of religions throughout the world. It's got really cool, eerie music in the background. All right, so that's an interesting map of the growth of different world religions. And of course, with the discussion that I'm talking about tonight, the fate of the unevangelized, and Christianity is all over the world today. All right, it's the largest world religion on the planet today. But if you saw in the video, like where like India, Pakistan, the Middle East, or the like, sometimes they call this the 1040 window, between the 1040 parallels. And that's the least evangelized parts of the world for various reasons. And of course, the question is like, well, I mean, Christianity spread a lot, but it hadn't got to everyone. And Christianity didn't even get started before certain religions like Hinduism or Judaism. And so there are obviously people that have not heard about Christianity because they predated Christianity. Continue with our discussion on world religions itself, just sort of like seeing that's sort of how it played out on a map. Here's sort of ideologically how world religions play out. They're basically three world views. There's naturalism, theism, and pantheism. When you see ism on the end of a word, sounds really scary, but just means belief in. Like ology means, like at the end of a word, like biology. What does ology mean? Study of, bios is life. Ism means belief in. You look to the root word, see what they're believing in. What's the root word of naturalism? Nature. So this is the belief that only physical nature exists. Theism, everybody see the root word there? Well, theos, yeah, for God, the Greek word for God. And pantheism, pan means what? Anybody know? It means all, so the belief that all is God. And everyone on the planet is one of these three worldviews. There are no other worldviews that I'm aware of. I don't know how you'd arrange things to get a fourth worldview out there, but it seems to be the case that these are all the worldviews that there are: naturalism, theism, and pantheism. And every philosophy and ideology, hold your question till the end. All right, every philosophy or theology, I got the PhD now, I am pulling that card out on my students every day. Yeah. So anyways, let me just finish through this and I'll get it to you. All right, so of this, Every philosophy, world religion, ideology stems from one of these three worldviews. So, for example, examples of naturalistic worldviews that are a little more fleshed out than just simply there's only physical nature is like nihilism, the belief that, hey, the physical world is all there is, and then we're going to die, cease to exist, and nothing really matters, right? Nothing there is no greater meaning to life whatsoever. Existentialism is a naturalistic worldview that tries to overcome nihilism, but they do it through self-effort, through decisions. It's a very popular one in the West today. It's in all our movies and TV shows. Like when the protagonist faces an issue and he goes to a guru, or a sage, and he says, "What should I do?" And they always say, "Follow your." Yeah, that's existentialism, is what it is. All right, and a very popular version of it. It's a little more evolved than that. And then postmodernism is sort of the modern reaction to the Enlightenment of radical relativism. If you go over to pantheism, you get the three pantheistic religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and New Age, which are mainly in the East, though that is changing. And then theism has three theistic religions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity itself. So with the what's coming next? Yeah, with the theistic religions, it's how God has chosen to reveal himself. In Judaism, God is Yahweh, has revealed himself in the law. In Islam, Allah has revealed himself to Muhammad, who recorded it in the Quran. In Christianity, Jehovah has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. And then, of course, you get major divisions in Judaism, like Orthodox, Conservative, and Reformed. I'm not going to go into the details of these. Islam, you get Sunni, Sufi, and Shia. Christianity, you have Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. And even in Hinduism and Buddhism, you have further subdivisions. In Hinduism, like the way it works, devotion and knowledge. They have really, really fancy words that I cannot pronounce, so I'm going with these words right here. In Buddhism, you have Mahayana, Theravada, and Tibetan Buddhism, and it even further subdivides from there, but I don't have enough space on the screen, but that gives you sort of an idea. Would you have question, comment?
I was going to bring up
Yeah.
a potential alternative that I don't think anyone unironically holds, solipsism, which would be there is no natural world, there is no God, there is only this one perceiving being.
Yeah, there's different versions of that. There might be an idealism, a version of it, which is sort of a weird kind of nuance that it's a different kind of naturalism, but because there's no like supreme being, but it's sort of an interesting nuance of it. So there's another version out there. There's another worldview out there, but I just sort of put like solipsism into naturalism because it's sort of what it devolves into, but it's not quite there. I would agree with that. There's not a whole lot of people that are that though. Then the theistic, there's another one called deism. Right? Deism, that their God created the universe and everything, but he doesn't interact with it. He's completely distant from it. But I just sort of put it under theism, itself, is what I do. But it's just sort of interesting to see how this plays out. Here's where the numbers play out on a pie chart. Graphically, a third of the planet is Christian, 21 to 25, a quarter of the planet is Islamic, 13% Hindu, Buddhist 5 to 6%, non-religious. And non-religious doesn't mean necessarily atheistic, naturalistic, right? About half of it is nuns, not nuns in the habits, but nuns, N-O-N-E-S. They're like, oh, I'm not any particular religion, but I'm spiritual. It's really weird because like half of the nuns pray, every day, read the Bible once a week or read the Quran once a week, but they're not any particular religion. So it's about 7% that are atheistic or agnostic. And then all the other religions, about 12 to 13%. Numerically, it plays out like this, with Christianity being the largest at 2.1 billion. This is a little low because I put this slide together several years ago, and more like 2.3 to 2.5 billion, today. Islam, that is way low, 1.6 billion. It's probably 1.8 to 2 billion today. And then you get the secular non-religious, about 1 billion. And again, half of it is atheist naturalistic, half of it is nuns again. Hindu, about 900, probably a billion today. Chinese traditional religions, with 400 million. Buddhism, that one's pretty static. It's still really at 370, 380 million. And then it goes down from there, with Judaism. Now, and I highlighted the 5 because those are sometimes seen as the 5 major world religions. And they're a major world religion not because of size, because Judaism only 14 million people. There's actually more Jews in America than Israel. And there's actually more Jews in New York City than Jerusalem, interestingly enough. And they're moving to Miami. I was in Miami a couple of years ago, and like the Hasidic Orthodox Jews are moving down to Miami. And I was walking along the beach. I'm like, what the what? I was like, well, I thought I was in New York for some reason. It was really, really strange. And so you got all these other religions sort of spread out there. And it's sort of like a graph. This is such a messy graph. I don't know why I put this on here. Maybe just the pictures. We'll go with that. So about 9 billion people by 2045. And yeah, this is why I put it, is the trajectory right here, that Islam and Christianity are growing the quickest. And they say by 2050, that's in 25 years, it will be a third of the planet will be Christian, a third of the planet will be Muslim, and a third of the planet will be every other religion itself. And the way they do this demographic studies is birth rates. That's the only way you can consistently do a future demographic. And even then, they tend to be wrong. It does not take into consideration conversion rates from one religion to another, because you cannot predict that itself. Though, if current conversion rates continue, Christianity will outstrip Islam, because there's more Muslims converting to Christianity than Christians converting to Islam, as well. And a lot of it is in Muslim countries, they're having more children than in the traditional Christian countries. But when you think of traditional Christian countries, what countries are you thinking of? What regions of the world are you thinking of? Yeah, Europe, America. Interestingly enough, Christianity has not been a Western religion for over 50 years. Well over 50. It might have been more like 60, 70 years now. There are more Christians outside of Europe and America and Australia than inside Europe and America and Australia, like in South America, Central America, the Asias, and Africa. The power centers of Christianity is moving to Africa, is where it's actually moving towards. And their birth rates are much higher than European Christians and American Christians as well. So it's really hard to do demographics when you got these kind of movements going on, itself. So that being said, this was just the graph that I just talked through without showing you the graph, itself. So like, here's the growth of just Christianity. I just thought this was an interesting graph, So in 1910, 60% of all Christians were in Europe, 27% were in the Americas. But now by 2010, Europe is only 25% of the Christians, America is the 36%, and that would include like South America as well as Americas. But now look at sub-Saharan Africa, that's everything south of the Sahara Desert. Huge explosions of Christianity. It's Pentecostal charismatic Christianity that's actually exploding there too, interestingly enough. Asia Pacific, it went from 4% to 13%, and even and looking at sub-Saharan Africa, it went from 1% to 23%. That's a massive growth rate. Another thing that I read is in
this out for me really quick.
Running out of battery.
Sorry.
Oh, we'll just put it
I
on.
charged it.
I'll put more on. More money. All right, there we go. So double the pay. All right, zero, 2 times 0. So, anyways, but this is the idea, all right? That all religions are really teaching the same thing. All religions are true. Just like it's sort of like the old adage. There's many ways to the top of Mount Fuji. Or I've never been to Mount Fuji, so I use Pikes Peak as an example because I've been to Pikes Peak right out of Colorado Springs, and when I went there, there's different ways to the top of Pikes Peak. You could hike. No way I'm doing that. It's way too high, 14,000 feet or plus. You could drive. That's what I did because it was cheapest. You could take a train, right? And I looked into that, but it was like $50 a person. I had like my wife and me and my 2 boys. I said, I ain't doing that. I was like, that's over $100, $200, right? And then you can take like a helicopter. I don't know what that would cost, and the like. But you all end up at the same place, don't you? Right? Is sort of the idea. There's an old Hindu parable. I think it's a Hindu parable of like 4 or 5 blind men walk up to an elephant and they feel different parts of the elephant. Have you heard this old parable before? It's a great parable, right? And what you probably don't know is that the parable is actually always told incompletely. All right, and I'll get to that in a moment. All right, but the parable is like one feels like the leg of the elephant. It says, oh, an elephant is like a big tree. One feels like the tail. He's like a rope. And one feels like his trunk. Oh, no, he's like a snake. One feels the side. He's a wall. What are you talking about? One feels the tusk. He's like a spear, right? Well, they're all correct, aren't they? And you're like, just because, they're all true. Now, what's interesting about the Hindu parable is it's always incomplete because there's another monk who actually can see that's up on a balcony and he tells them all they're wrong. That's what they do. We never get that part of the parable. I've always thought that was interesting. I just found that out recently. All right, so that's pluralism. There's actually 2 types of pluralism, and I'm going to actually show you a video here in a minute. The first type of pluralism is sort of like the Mahatma Gandhi pluralism. All religions teach the same thing, right? And this is what I call naive pluralism, right? It's like they're all true. And that really doesn't make much sense to say they're all true because they always teach so many different things. More sophisticated, and this is actually John Hick's view of pluralism, is they're all false, right, is what they are, but they all get to the same result is what they do, right? So let's take a look at the other 2 views. Inclusivism, all who are saved by Christ, but conscious faith in him is not necessary. So the only way you're going to get to God is through Jesus. And it happens to be that Christianity knows it's Jesus, right, is what's going on. You do not need to be aware of what Jesus did to receive the benefit of what Jesus did. It's sort of like, look, I mean, how many, you got the 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights, right? Does anybody know the 8th Amendment offhand? All right? No, don't, okay, well, pick me one you don't know. All right, you just ruined my example. Thanks a lot. All right, pick me one that you don't know. What? 17th Amendment. All right, so you don't know the 17th Amendment. Everyone else, just go, yes, I don't know it either. Right? Okay, we'll go with that for my example. Don't ruin it. All right, I'm just going to march out of here. All right, so anyways, teach yourself. All right, but anyways, no one knows the 17th Amendment. I don't know the 17th Amendment for that matter. Don't look it up, right? But does that mean you're looking it up? Don't look. I just said don't look it up. All right. But just because we don't know what the 17th Amendment, does that mean we don't receive the benefit of the 17th Amendment? Exactly. You don't have to be aware of it to receive the benefit of it. And that's sort of the inclusivist view. You don't have to be aware of who Jesus is, hence the dotted lines from these other religions, to receive the benefit of what Jesus did. God in his mercy and grace extends the work of Christ on the cross to all people. That's the inclusivist view. Some people that adhere to this are John Sanders, Clark Pinnock. Clark Pinnock used to be a Baptist theologian. He passed away a couple of years ago. John Sanders still very active today, that talks about this as well. Yes?
When it says all who are saved by Christ and just don't know it, what do you mean when all who are saved? What defines the original saved?
Yeah, usually, depending on the inclusivists you talk to, there's some like, there's some people, they're not going to be saved. They're so bad, like Trump. Or something like that, Hitler, Elon Musk, those people, they're not going to receive salvation. They exclude, the really, really awful people, just think, no, they sort of need punishment is what they do. So, but if anyone is going to be saved, if they are saved, it's going to be through Christ, whether they're aware of Christ or not. It's still ultimately the work of Christ that provides salvation. Does that may help? And the Trump, that was a joke. Oh, yeah. You looked really concerned there for a minute, you know.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand. So what you're saying is basically it's this idea that like most people are saved because they're good. It just all that is happening through Christ.
Well, again, it depends on the inclusivists you talk to. Some say no, it's not because you're good. It's still just the work and grace of Christ on the cross that provides salvation. People are doing the best they can with the information they have. God in His grace says, "Yep, they're doing the best they can. I want to extend salvation to them." You know, that's what and it's a way to resolve the whole problem of, hey, what about those who never heard about Christ? Well, the other view is like, Christ don't really matter. You know, it's just everyone's going to get to God. It's a pluralistic view. Or almost everyone. Depending on the pluralist. And this is a way to resolve that tension of like, oh no, you don't have to hear about Jesus to receive the benefit. And even some Christians, I would actually say all Christians actually believe this, and to some extent, in the Jewish religion, because prior to the coming of Christ, did Abraham know about Jesus? No, but Paul really talks about how he received the benefit of what Jesus did, so that's inclusivism, to what's going on. And then Pinnock and Sanders, they extend it beyond that is what they do. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah. Good question. And funny joke, too. Y'all can laugh. I appreciate it. All right. Let's take a look at the third view. All those who place their faith in Jesus are saved. And you've got to consciously place your faith in Jesus. If you don't consciously place your faith in Jesus, you're on the wrong side of the line. It's the red line. See what I'm saying there? Okay, that was a flat joke. I'm going to rework that one. What? Yep, that. I was going for hell. But anyways, blood of Jesus. Oh my gosh, you're so religious. All right, but some proponents of this are Doug Guyvett, teaches at Biola University. Ronald Nash, he passed away. He used to teach at Western, I think it was Western Kentucky University. But they're more of the exclusivist brand. Yes, and Baptist. All Baptists are this as well. Yes.
Christianity isn't mentioned up there. It looks like only Jesus himself was saved.
Oh yeah, that was low, man. That was low. That's really interesting. Jesus never became a Christian. Have you ever thought about that before? He did not need to believe in himself for salvation. He's a Jew, all right? So any Christian that's an anti-Semite has to hate Jesus because he's Jewish. It just doesn't make a lick of sense to me at all, for that. Anyways, I always thought that was really interesting. All right, so those are the different views. So let's take a look at this question with a video on is Jesus actually the only way? Is exclusivism, does pluralism make any sense at all, right? Are all religions true? Let's take a look at this question with this video.
In AD 203, the Roman government arrested a 22-year-old woman, a Christian named Perpetua. The problem wasn't so much that she worshipped Jesus. Her crime was that she worshipped only Jesus. She refused to worship any other gods. As a result, she was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. This dangerous idea that Christ alone provides the way to God is called Christian particularism, and it is as scandalous today as it was 2,000 years ago. Religious pluralism, on the other hand, is the view that all the world's religions are equally valid, and Christ is just one of many ways. Some religious pluralists say all the world's religions teach basically the same thing, so they are all true. But this is clearly mistaken. The major religions often contradict each other. For example, compare Islam and Buddhism. Muslims believe there is a personal God who created the world. Man is sinful and will spend eternity in heaven or hell, and salvation is attained by faith and performing good works. But Buddhists deny all of this. They believe that ultimate reality is not a person. The world was not created. Man is not sinful. Man is not an enduring self. And the goal of life is not salvation, it's annihilation. Because these two worldviews contradict each other, they can't both be true. In fact, every major world religion contradicts every other one. so they can't possibly all be true. So other religious pluralists will say all the world's religions are false. They're equally valid, but equally false. Cultural expressions of mankind's search for truth. But why think that this is true? Why couldn't one particular religion be true? When you examine the arguments for religious pluralism, you find that some of them are textbook examples of logical fallacies. For example, anyone who believes that Christianity is true and every other view is wrong is arrogant. Therefore, Christianity is false. This is a logical fallacy called argument ad hominem, trying to show someone's view is false by attacking his personal character. This is a logical fallacy because the truth of a view is independent of the character of the person who holds it. For example, if an arrogant person discovered the cure for cancer, the fact that he's egotistical would not mean his claim was false, and you wouldn't refuse treatment just because he was conceited. Moreover, this objection is a double-edged sword, for the pluralist also believes that his view is true and that everyone else is wrong. Therefore, if you're arrogant for holding to a view which many others disagree with, then the pluralist himself would be guilty of arrogance. There is another pluralist argument. Religions are culturally relative. If you have been born in Pakistan, you'd likely be a Muslim. But if you've been born in Ireland, you'd probably be a Catholic. Because religious beliefs are culturally relative, they are not objectively true. This is an example of the genetic fallacy, trying to invalidate a view by showing how a person came to hold the view. This is a fallacy because the truth of a view is independent of how a person came to believe it. For example, if you had been born in ancient Greece, you would have believed that the sun goes around the earth. Does that make your current belief that the earth goes around the sun false or unjustified? No. Furthermore, this objection is also a double-edged sword. For if the religious pluralist had been born in Pakistan or Ireland, he'd likely have been a religious particularist. So his belief in religious pluralism is just the result of his being born in contemporary Western society, and therefore is not objectively true. Getting these fallacious objections out of the way helps to reveal a more serious objection to Christian particularism, the problem of those who have never heard of Christ. If Jesus is the only way to God, then what is the fate of those who never hear of Jesus? Is there no hope for them? The answer is, there is hope for those who've never heard. The Bible says that God loves all people and wants everyone to come to him and find eternal life. God desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and men, the man, Christ Jesus.
All right, so religious pluralism has some major flaws in it, as the video was pointing out. But it still leaves us with a question about the fate of the unevangelized, about those who never had a chance to hear the gospel. And that's what I want to address now, answering the charge. It's unjust for God to condemn those who never had an opportunity to hear the gospel. Because, come on, if God's all-knowing, he knows how to get the gospel to everyone. If he's all-powerful, he should have the ability to get the gospel to everyone. Has the gospel gotten to everyone? Well, no, obviously not. I mean, people in Mesoamerica, 200, AD 200, there is no way the gospel got to them, because there were no missionary efforts or the like. But I actually don't think this is the issue of just people who never had a chance to hear the gospel. That's actually not really the issue, okay? Because aren't there people, if they had heard the gospel, they would have rejected it anyways? Isn't that a possibility? Yeah, I think it would. I don't know, it's a possibility. It's probably the case. So does God have any obligation to get the gospel to those people? Because what would they freely do anyways? They would freely reject it. So here, we're now subdividing different categories of people, right? And so I got like this taxonomy of people that hear the gospel and people that don't hear the gospel. So the left column are people that hear the gospel, and on the right column are people that don't hear the gospel. And then the rows are people's response to the gospel. top row are people that accept the gospel, like me. I don't know about you, but I definitely want to. Right? And people that don't accept the gospel. That's the bottom row. All right? So notice there's actually 4 types of people that we're concerned with here. Right? So you got the top left quadrant, people that hear the gospel, and when they heard it, they freely accepted it. When I say accepted it, they are ones freely accepting it. It's assuming libertarian free will. Okay? Then there's people that hear the gospel, and when they heard it, they freely accepted it. Okay? And so that's these two rows, these quadrants. The right 2 quadrants are people at the bottom right, people that don't hear the gospel, but had they heard it, they would have freely rejected it. And then the top right quadrant, people that don't hear the gospel, but had they heard it, they would have freely accepted it. I actually think what's going on here is we're not concerned with this category. We're not concerned with this category. We're not even concerned with this category because what would they freely do? So there's no point in getting the gospel to them because God knows what they would freely do. Okay? See, knowing something doesn't determine something, does it? Okay? You know, and I'm going to just go with that assumption. I can give reasons for it, but I'm just going to go with that assumption. We're not even concerned with that category. Here's the category that we're really concerned with. People that don't hear the gospel, but had they heard it, they would have freely accepted it. I think the first category, people that hear the gospel and accept it, I think God creates them, right? I'm one of them, right? Maybe Alan. Rest of you, verdict's still out. You never know, all right? And then there's people that hear the gospel and they reject it, right? And God creates them, right? They had the opportunity to hear it and respond to it, and they freely rejected it. The bottom right one, this is an interesting one. I think God creates people that don't hear the gospel. Had accepted, they would still freely reject it. People in this category would have rejected the gospel had they heard it, and there's no point in giving them the gospel because what would they freely do if they genuinely heard an authentic version of the gospel? They would have freely rejected it. But let's go to this category that we're overwhelmingly concerned with. People that don't hear the gospel, but had they heard it, they would have freely accepted it. My contention in this model is God doesn't create those kind of people. They don't exist. Now, here's the deal. I'm not saying this is actually what the case is, but what I'm saying is it a possibility? And what I mean by possibility, is there any contradiction involved? And I don't see any contradiction, right? And so what happens is there are people that don't hear the gospel but would have freely accepted it. God being all-knowing knows what they would freely do. And if they would freely accept the gospel had they heard it, God being all-powerful makes sure they hear the gospel by creating them a time or place, or, you can even, and there's some empirical evidence for this that I won't go into, by sending angelic visitations, visions, dreams. We have some empirical evidence that actually occurred. Right? And so, literally, there aren't people who don't hear the gospel, but they would have accepted it had they freely accepted it had they heard it. So there are no people who would have accepted the gospel. I just said that. All right. So let me simplify it. Right, and I can simplify it because I remember my son Ethan. When he was 10 years old, he was brushing his teeth one night, ready to go to bed. I'm like, dude, go to bed. I got studying to do, and I just want to be left alone. So he's brushing his teeth in the bathroom, and he comes out of the bathroom, and he rips the toothbrush out of his mouth, slinging toothpaste on the wall. It's still on the wall today. I still see the toothpaste on the wall. And he looked at me, and as a 10-year-old, he said, Dad. I go, what? What's going on? What's wrong? Maybe like a spider in the bathroom or something. He goes, and this is what he said. He said, what about those people that never hear about Jesus? I'm like, what the crap are you thinking at 10 years old? Go to freaking bed, man. And I'm like, I've got to answer this kid in a way that he understands in a short enough time span to get him to bed as quickly as possible. That's the goal. Really not about answering, just get him to bed. And this is what I said. It sort of summarizes this, all right? And then I'll show you a video, and then we'll sort of wrap it up with some questions and conclude for the evening. This is what I said. I said, Ethan, if anyone would accept the gospel, God makes sure he hears it. That's what it means to be all-powerful and all-knowing, all right? Now, again, I'm not saying this is the way the world works, okay? But in my feeble mind, which I completely plagiarized from William Lane Craig, right? So, you know, if we can come up with a consistent model that absolves God of any wrongdoing of people who would have freely accepted the gospel, but they never had a chance to hear it, I think God, who is much smarter than us, can take care of reality just fine. Right? So essentially what you'd have to do is to show that this is not a logical possibility. And there's ways to attempt to do that and the like. But I think there's actually even scriptural evidence that this is the case from Acts 17, 24 to 28. But I'll go ahead and play this video that actually quotes that verse and extends on this discussion that I've just been having with you.
Early Christians proclaimed that Jesus is the only way of salvation, the only way to forgiveness and eternal life, the only way to God. In our day and age, however, many consider this to be unacceptable and deeply offensive. But why? Isn't it possible that Jesus is the only way? Many people object, saying, if Jesus is the only way, then what about people who've never heard of him? They don't have a chance to be saved. But they do. God is not unfair. The Bible says that God wants all persons to be saved. Those who have never heard of Christ will not be judged on the basis of what they don't know. They'll be judged on the basis of what they do know. So, what do people who have never heard of Christ know? There are two truths God has revealed to everyone, everywhere. First, he exists. We all know this by observing the natural world around us. And second, there's a moral law. We all know this by experiencing our conscience within us. Every one of us has a moral sense of right and wrong. So those who never hear of Christ can still respond to the light they have been given in nature and conscience. On the basis of their knowledge of God and the moral law, they can turn to God for forgiveness and new life. Just like people who lived prior to the time of Christ, they can be saved through Christ, even though they haven't heard of Christ. But what about people who don't respond to God's self-revelation in nature and conscience? Granted, they freely separate themselves from God by rejecting his self-revelation to them, and God won't force them to believe if they don't want to. But maybe they would have believed in Christ if only they had heard about him. Are they just victims of bad luck, born at the wrong time and place in history? No, for according to the Bible, the times and places that people are born is not the result of accident. Rather, God decides where and when each person will live. So it's possible that God has so ordered the world that anyone who would believe in Christ if he heard about him is created at a time and a place in history where he does hear about him. Thus, no one is lost through historical or geographical accident. Anyone who wants or even would want to be saved will be saved. Our eternal destiny truly lies in our own hands. So, how about you? God made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us.
All right, sorry, got excited. So I said, what about you? I was like, oh, I'll give an answer. All right, so, but anyways, when it comes to the issue of religious pluralism, or to look at it with the question of, well, what about those who've never heard or had a chance to hear the gospel? This is one that really plugged me early in my Christian education studies. You know, actually when I went to seminary, I went to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and this one really, really perplexed me. And I went, you know, remember the three views? You got pluralism, inclusivism, and exclusivism. I went through all three of those views, and through different iterations. Man, I plowed through John Hick. I plowed through, you know, Bishop Spong, you know, and the like. I mean, I read all of Clark Pinnock. You know, why were y'all laughing at him when he came up? Why was that funny?
One night, actually 2 nights, we watched the debate between him and William Lane Craig.
Oh, that's too funny.
Yeah.
That's really funny. Oh, wow. Was that on the resurrection?
And I'm part of his denomination.
What was the debate topic? Resurrection?
It was, what was it?
It was the
Yeah, it was resurrection. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. But this one really plagued me, and it took years, to figure out this. And when I came across Molinism, did you notice it utilized Molinism? Not only does God know what you could do if you heard the gospel, He knows what you would freely do if you heard the gospel, and if you would freely accept it, He's going to create you so you will freely accept the gospel. And so Molinism has this sort of really interesting, powerful, explanatory system, not only for things like this, but a whole lot of other things, like God knowing what we're going to freely do, and it doesn't take away our authentic freedom, but it resolves a whole lot of interesting doctrinal issues. And amongst philosophers of religion, in the evangelical community at least, Molinism is just taken off. It really is a really interesting phenomenon that's occurring. The only objection that I can think of, and I've heard it from people before on this one, is like, wait a minute, if God knows they would reject the gospel, whether they hear it or not, people that bottom row, people that you hear it and reject it, or would have rejected it, how they heard it, why does God create them? If they're not going to receive salvation, wouldn't it be better if they didn't exist? Well, there might be other overriding reasons God has to create them. For example, maybe it could be the case that all their descendants receive salvation. And if God didn't create that one person, then all those descendants don't receive the benefit of salvation. And why would their free rejection of the gospel veto the existence of all these people that receive salvation? And so it's sort of a way to mitigate that, And of course, these are sort of thorny issues, and it's hard to think, like, well, how do we know what will, would, or could happen? And they're still trying to figure it out, but I think this one helps resolve it for me a little bit, at least this model. And if I can come up with a model and find a model like this, then I think God can take care of reality pretty well. Yeah.
The wouldn't it better objection also carries an assumption that to cause suffering is always a moral evil, or that what is morally best is always that which causes the least suffering.
Yeah, that is the question of, if I'm understanding you correctly, causing suffering is not always evil or wrong, or causing pain is not, because like when you go work out, what are you doing? You're causing pain. No pain, no gain. That's why I don't work out. So, but anyways, sorry, that was a freebie right there. But we actually go on the way of suffering a lot of it. I mean, going to school. Yeah, you do this for entertainment? There's something wrong with you. I mean, seriously. You do it because you suffer and you go through sleep deprivation, when you're studying and the like, so that you can get a good degree, get a good job, and provide for you and your family or whatever you want to do, because that's a greater benefit to it. It's a greater good attached to it. I think that's what you're getting at. Is that what you're getting at?
Pretty much.
Yeah. So that's real interesting. And so that, given that you talked about suffering and pain and evil, that's the other issue that's really disturbed me, is the problem of evil, right? I'm like, oh my gosh, why, if God's all powerful, why doesn't He prevent evil? And if He's all good, He should want to prevent evil, but that's a different subject. Maybe we'll have to come back and talk about that. I think there's really good answers to it, but and what I mean answers to it, there's good answers to the intellectual problem of evil, but there's still evil in the world. Even though we might, maybe God is justifying allowing a certain amount of evil in the world, there's still evil. We still got to go through crap in the world, don't we? Right? And that's not the intellectual evil, that's the emotional problem. I don't know if you've ever heard of that distinction before. Intellectual evil is thinking about evil. I've got a lot of evil. But emotional evil is going through it, it's experiencing it. And that's a different type of evil, and that's another one that I struggle with as well. We also have, questions, doubts, and concerns, and those are some of the ones that I've gone through. This is definitely one of them. It took me years to get through this one, and I'm thankful I came across Molinism, from, William Lane Craig and the like, also Alva Planning has done a lot of work on this, and some other scholars as well. So any other questions, comments? Yeah.
It seems to me that, like, given Molinism and that God in an infinite number of scenarios, it seems to me that the scenarios would have the power to result in a person either accepting or rejecting God. Say like C.S. Lewis, like if he had a similar scenario but then died before he converted.
Yeah.
It seems like there's an infinite number of futures where he would accept it, but also an infinite number where he would reject it.
Yeah,
based on the situation.
yeah. They're really interesting because like if you generate enough possible worlds, can't you get the best possible world? In those scenarios. A couple of problems that I can think of. I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. Infinites can't exist as real things. You can't have an infinite number of worlds. Another one is, well, it might be the case that of all the possible worlds, there's an infinite, right? And that's God's natural knowledge. But then you take those possible worlds, and then given what we would freely do, it begins to eliminate the feasibility of them. And there's now a limited number of feasible worlds that God has access to of what we would freely do. Yeah, maybe, so-and-so would have accepted the gospel. It's logically possible that someone would accept the gospel. That's a logical possibility. But what would they freely do? Always reject it. And there's no feasible world in which he would accept the gospel. And that's not a world that God could create because it's not feasibly accessible to him. Right? And it's not logically possible for God to bring about where someone would freely accept the gospel when they would always freely reject it, is what they would do. And so he is limited to those feasible worlds. And some people are like, well, oh my gosh, God's not all powerful. God can't do anything he wants. Well, welcome to the Bible. Right? That's what the Bible says. God can't do anything he wants. It says God can't lie. There's lots of things God can't do. Like he can't create a rock so big that he can't lift it. Actually, that's a question that doesn't even make sense. It's incoherent. He can't make a one-ended stick. He can't make me a married bachelor like I'd like to be. Let's delete this. All right, I don't need my wife saying that. That was a joke, Angela. My heart's for you, babe. My heart's for you. Me, that was close. All right. Oh my God. Nice knowing you. I'm now divorced and all my money's going to her. All right.
Can I
So,
make a quick point about that?
yeah, go ahead.
Maybe, God kept C.S. Lewis alive in World War I when he almost, he got injured pretty bad and so forth. Maybe he makes sure they don't die prematurely in that kind of scenario.
Yeah. It just seems hard to me to think that like for every single person, they all got to a state that they would accept it if in any scenario they would have accepted God.
Yeah, it is quite mind-boggling, isn't it? Because you're talking these sets of worlds that are just
It's definitely something only God
massive
can do, right?
amounts.
Right.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
you can debate whether he did that or not, but
Yeah. And of course, the point is, in here we're like, okay, what is the plausibility of this even being actual? Well, it's not really. Is it actual? Is it possible? And it is. Doesn't really, fall into any contradiction. And if it's a possibility, it resolves the tension. And that's what it's trying to do. And this is what philosophers call the difference between actually telling the truth and then providing a defense. Right? And the defense is, wait a minute, you're saying that, but this is not actually the possibility. I don't have to actually provide the actual answer, just that one doesn't work, to what's going on. And that's sort of what this is doing. It's more of a defense than it is, sort of like sometimes called a theodicy. Theodicy is the actual reasons God allows certain things or causes certain things or brings about certain things. But this is more of a defense of, well, this would resolve God of any moral responsibility, and if we can come up with a model, then, you can't necessarily say God is at fault now, because this is a plausible model. You had a question, didn't you, right?
Yeah, I was wondering in the Foursquare model you had, would, for example, Abraham, in the example you gave, have to fall into the did not hear and would not accept square for the gospel?
Did Abraham?
Like Abraham, for example, did not hear the
Yeah.
would
See,
not
that's a
accept it.
special case. It might not fall into. I don't know. Let me think through this.
that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a really good question because that's sort of a different category, isn't it? Because he didn't hear the gospel, so he's on the right side.
But he responded to God.
But he responded, so he accepted. Now, here's the deal. This is what you can start now talking about, like categories of okay, pre-Jesus or Judaism. They still received salvation because of the system they were in was pointing to the greater truth of Christ. Now, this technically, I don't know if any of you saw this in the video. This technically means that Craig, of the three views of pluralism, inclusivism, and particularism, he's actually which one of the three?
Inclusive. Yeah.
He's an inclusivist, right? Baptists hate this, right? And he's Baptist, you know, on top of it.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
Baptist Church,
But
yeah.
I wouldn't call him just a full-on inclusivist of like, you know, like the type, you know, that I have listed here, like Pinnock or Sanders, right? He's what I would call a moderate inclusivist. And what I mean by moderate inclusivist is, yes, there's a possibility of even people right now who don't hear the gospel, if they respond to nature and the conscious, moral conscious within appropriately, God's going to extend salvation to them. But then he goes on to say in his published work is the amount of people that this actually applies to is probably minuscule, if any at all. Right? And that's sort of his modified exclusivism, because the Pinnock and Sanders are like, yeah, they're all going to receive salvation through Christ, even if they're not aware of him. He's like, no. Craig's like, yeah, they could, but there's so few that this applies to, if any at all, today, for sure, because of the sinfulness, you know, and depravity that we have in our lives.
And he'll
So,
point to some verses in like Romans 2.
yeah, it's Romans 2 that he did, points to
Yeah.
for this inclusive
It does seem to
position.
be talking along
Yeah.
those terms. but
Yeah, I go back and forth in agreeing and disagreeing with him, you know?
I'm kind of with you on that.
Yeah, it's,
like,
I don't know. Yeah, I can see. But he's a philosopher, and philosophers do things a little differently than theologians do,
yeah.
you know? And so I'll just grant him. He's doing philosophy at this point, I think, is what he's doing, you know, on the text. Yeah.
Another thing on that idea of like people who could be in the top right quadrant, given that there's like that the like second coming is thought to be a thing, that there should be a finite number of humans who will exist, then it seems, given that there could always be plus one.
Oh,
be
yeah.
that
I
there
see what you're
there
saying.
could be like
Yeah, and there would be other overriding concerns. That's a really great question. Man, these are really good questions. I really haven't thought about these through like this. But I think the way the Craig would respond with this position is the overriding concern, and this almost sounds like consequentialism, he's trying to maximize the number of people saved and minimize the number of people lost. And if he just goes on forever like that, yeah, there might be one more. Then the number of people lost might just start growing exponentially. And he's like, that's not justified. You know, does that make sense? You know, look, I'm just guessing off the top of my head because that's a really great question, actually. I really think that's an interesting question. Maybe you can write a dissertation on it, get a PhD. You know, man, I mean, that's what I should
That's a
have
sharp group.
done. Yeah, that is a really sharp question. Yeah, right here in the back.
I've got kind of a couple questions I'm working through.
Oh, we got time for one.
Let's just go with one right now.
That's
Yeah.
So
fine.
in order to make cases like Abraham or David work, I'm kind of wanting to put them in a different version of the heard and accepted box, even though they didn't hear the gospel because Jesus had not come to earth yet. They still heard and accepted a word from God.
Yeah, they
It
heard
made some
revelation.
sense.
Well
Like,
put,
they
Yeah, that's a good way to
they
put it.
received-
Maybe
they
you-
received-
Yeah, maybe you could do this. Take out the word gospel and just put revelation.
Yeah.
And then that would take care of those kind of categories. That's a
Divine
good point.
revelation
That's really good.
specifically.
Yeah, I could do that. I could see that. Here, this one is sort of like, what do we do in the present? You know, with what's going on. But then when you get the categories of, you know, the pre-Jesus, you know, Judaism, take out the word gospel and put revelation, and that would take for Old Covenant and New Covenant. Yeah, that's good. What was your other one that you got going?
Yeah, the other one is that I don't remember where in Romans this is, but there is a verse in Romans that says that faith comes by hearing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think with that in
Yeah, I
mind,
think it's Romans 10.
yeah.
Yeah. It says, it's about talking about the feet of those that bring the good news. And it says, how will those believe unless they hear? Right? And how will they hear unless someone preaches? How will someone preach unless they're sent? You know, and that one seems to be more of an exclusivist position. You know, I don't know how. I remember listening to a podcast of his one time. He answered that question, and he talked around it. You know, how those stinking philosophers.
Yeah,
You
what
know,
makes most sense to me is that like from those verses in Romans 1 and 2 would seem to be saying that all people are responsible before God because of what they know.
Mhm.
But that being responsible doesn't mean that everybody actually is going to respond.
Yeah. In that Romans 2 passage that Craig refers to, that says, "Hey, this might be a genuine option of salvation of those that don't haven't heard the gospel." Yes, maybe it's interpreted that way, but it doesn't have to be. I'm not overwhelmingly convinced of that interpretation, but I'm open
some
to
people
that
take it as like
interpretation.
a counterfactual.
They will
This is
be
possible, but
like-
it may not be realized.
Like where it says that they will by their obedience they're a law unto themselves or whatever the verse is. Nobody still perfectly obeys the law is the thing. And
Yeah.
like how do they know right the way how do they know that they need to like place their faith in God unless somebody tells them that that's how it works. Like I don't know that you could get all the way there just from natural
Yeah, I
revelation.
kind of read it that way too, because
Yeah.
then you get into Romans 3 and all of sin, and it's like, well, no one really did. This was a hypothetical. They could have responded, but it almost seems to later say they did. None were righteous. Not even one.
Yeah, and to be fair to Craig, I think Craig answers it this way. He says, let's take a Native American, you know, in Mesoamerica, and they know that, hey, there's something greater than just me. You know, the great spirit in the sky, which they actually have evidence of them, adhering to great spirits in the sky, and that, hey, I've got to, appease him, whatever you want to call it, and interact with him. And then Craig's going to say, yeah, they're doing the best they can with the information they have. God's going to extend salvation to that individual, if that is the case. And Buddy says it's probably not few and far between, if any at all. He always says that with a caveat. It's like if few and far between with any at all. And if there is, it's probably just a handful of people. Hence the modified, inclusivist position that he has. All right. Well, anybody else? This is a great discussion. Really, I really appreciate y'all's questions tonight because it pushed my thinking in ways I've never really thought about this as well. So I really appreciate it. Really sharp group, and that's why I like coming and talking with y'all. Is you just because I said it, you can push back and explore it and tweak it, and that was a lot of fun tonight. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do that.
Can I take one shot before we finish?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious if sort of a reframing of our understanding of the gospel beyond just dying and going to heaven, which is a way that is not often expressed in the New Testament, if at all, to more of a kingdom of God understanding of the gospel that is central to what Jesus preached, kind of in the N.T. Wright kind of way of talking about the gospel, could explain some of those questions. But then it also creates more questions on the other side of if the goal of life, as he says, is to colonize earth with the life of heaven, such that the dwelling place of God is with man, then you're going to have people who are living in a way that's contrary to that advancing kingdom of God made possible through Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any just reflections about that.
Yeah, I'm not as up to date on N.T. Wright's view, but he does have a very unique perspective on that, on that more than just it's not about dying and going to heaven, but about building the kingdom of God, which I tend to agree. The way that we usually present the gospel is sort of like, oh, this is how they say it in VBS. You invite Jesus into your heart and you get to go to heaven. Technically, Jesus doesn't live in your heart because you'd be dead. He has a physical body right now, according to the Bible. It's the spirit that indwells you. And then when you die, you don't go to heaven. You're going to be a disembodied soul in the presence, quote unquote, of God, which has no physical location whatsoever. And then there's going to be the end and the judgment, and we'll receive resurrected bodies. There will be physical bodies, and there will be the new heaven and new earth, according to Revelation 21, and we will reside on this earth that will be ultimately redeemed. And that's more of an N.T. Wright kind of view. I don't know exactly where he falls on, like the disembodied souls and all that. That's where I'm not.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
N.T. Wright. Yeah.
I was wondering if there. Okay, so a lot of the discussion about whether people hear and accept or not accept is addressing God's love, but sometimes it sounds like it's like, is God morally allowed to do this? But to me, and maybe this is a little bit of a hot take, is God not morally allowed to just like strike everybody dead, by judgment at this current moment?
Yeah, there are Christian traditions, that the Reformed and Calvinist tradition, that God doesn't owe salvation to anybody, and He has every right to condemn anyone to hell because that's exactly what they deserve, itself. And so I'm reminiscent towards it somewhat, that yes, we're depraved, we deserve damnation, but also and here's the tension: God is a just God, and He must punish sin. Because if He didn't punish sin, He wouldn't be a good, just God, right? But also, He is simultaneously a loving God and a merciful God, and He wants to forgive. But if you forgave all sins, then He's not just any longer, So literally, God's in a dilemma, is what it is, between His justice and His love, right? And what happened is, God has to punish sin, but He wants to forgive. How does He resolve that tension? And this is where you get Anselm, who is a perfect being theologian, because that was part of my dissertation. And he said, that's why you had to have the incarnation and the death of Jesus on the cross. Have you ever wondered, why did Jesus have to die? Have you ever wondered that? Well, I can't just forgive you, because then He's not just. He will punish all sin. Either you will receive the punishment, or you let Jesus receive the punishment. And that allows God to be completely just. But if we allow Jesus to receive the punishment, it allows God to be loving and forgiving, simultaneously. So it's sort of interesting, these different traditions, that I tend to be not Calvinistic myself, but there is a rich Calvinistic Reformed tradition there. It's, hey, they don't deserve, none of them deserve salvation. I tend to think they overemphasize certain aspects of God's attributes, like His sovereignty and justice and wrath, which are really not talked about in contemporary evangelical churches today in America. The wrath of God, you hear about the loving God a lot, don't you? But I think that sometimes there's also the love and mercy of God, and it's a balance you got to strike, and He wants all people to be saved. He literally, it says that. I can't remember the verse offhand. I read the Bible once. It's pretty good. So, I can't remember a verse. That's my go-to joke right there. Where He says He desires all people to receive salvation. So but I'm like, okay, He has the right to judge, but He wants to forgive. Is what's going. So it's not an either or. It's a both and we as finite individuals try to understand that balance as best we can. That's a great question. Great point.
All right, I think we really are out of time. Let's thank Steve.
Where do we want to go after this? I have no idea. Huh? Brahms? Okay. Okay. Anybody who wants to go to Brahms, then we'll be going to Brahms.